what we're going to address today is learning the ropes as a new minister. And my colleague Zoe Gurin, who's over on the left, who has done much of the work here on ministerial background and training, she and I have a slight disagreement when you're a new minister, when you move on from being a new minister. But we'll deal with that in the course of the discussion, which will be exactly an hour. One of the themes of the work we do here is looking at what makes an effective minister. Zoe and I did a report 2 years ago on this. It's easy to describe, harder to develop. And one of the traps, I can't claim we've totally avoided, is to have a kind of slightly Superman or Superwoman view of what makes an effective minister. When we did the report, we asked people, civil servants, politicians, everyone, who was they thought their most effective minister. And Michael Heseltine came top. Michael is a governor of the Institute, so he was very pleased when I told him that. I'm very glad to see his former private secretary sitting in the second row. But many of the qualities Michael had aren't at least transferable. He's a very effective minister, but he can't exactly be copied by other people because of the very qualities. Another person who's regarded as an effective minister is my predecessor as director, Andrew Adonis, who was sitting here a couple of weeks ago talking about his new book. Again, Andrew has a particular view of what makes an effective minister, which isn't easily transferable. So our aim is to make people more effective, not to conform to some easy model. Now, why we wanted to talk to Nick, because he's an unusual minister because he was more involved with the processes of government and the preparation for government than many of his colleagues. And that perhaps may make him atypical. But what we want to explore, talking to Nick, is, in a sense, partly the chronology and the development of what makes an effective minister. Apart from the details of what he does, we're not talking about planning today. We're talking about what you do and become as a minister. A brief bit of biography first. Nick ran his own, set up and ran his own business. He set up and ran a think tank for 5 years. He acted as chief of staff to what we now learn as the new biographer of Churchill, Boris Johnson. Whether Boris's book rivals Roy Jenkins' biography of Churchill is a matter for debate. We'll rival it. And then worked, particularly relevant to us, where we first became closely involved in the Institute, with Francis Maud on the what's called implementation work before the election, preparing the Conservatives over 2009 and early 2010 for the election on that, but drawing on some of his experiences working with Boris. Well, it worked out slightly differently in the case of the current government. He then served as a PPS to one of the education ministers, and then himself became planning minister. Now, Nick, let's start. How relevant to your experience as a minister was your preparatory phase of running your own business? Because that's rather unusual. Most of your fellow MPs run or don't run their own offices, but they haven't actually had much experience of running anything organisationally.
I'm sure that it does have some relevance. On the other hand, I think that Michael Heseltine is a exception in so many ways, and one of the ways in which he's an exception is the intensity with which he got involved in the organisational structure, the staffing of the department, and imposed a view of how he wanted that changed and moved around. And I think that it's rare that that's something that ministers can do. I think it's probably even fair to say that it's rare that they should do it. And certainly I haven't tried to do that. There's been a very substantial restructuring of DCLG that was led and driven by Eric Pickles and Bob Kerslake, which was pretty much bedded in by the time I got there. So I certainly haven't pretended to be, chief executive of the planning department in DCLG at all. I guess that the main thing is that I think a lot of it is about how you approach decisions. And the one thing that you know if you run a business is that decisions are inescapable, that a delayed decision is often as bad as a bad decision, and you've got to find a way to get yourself comfortable with, yes, asking all the questions you need, but even if you don't have every single piece of information in place, of making a decision. And I think that the business, obviously in very different contexts with very different measures, nevertheless does prepare you for that well, if you're running a business.
What about running a think tank? Is
Certainly
that a help or a hindrance? Then?
Certainly don't have to make any decisions then. No, I think running a think tank is helpful in a completely different respect, and that is, running a think tank, you are permanently trying to get noticed, and not just noticed for, streaking down the street, but noticed for an argument. And so you're permanently thinking of both how do I simplify my argument, simplify, so that I can make it understandable to anyone, and then how do I find new ways to get people to report the very simplified argument, and that is something that especially if you're running a think tank, is absolutely critical, and it's certainly true as a very junior minister in a government doing a lot of things. That's also a fairly important art, I think.
Now the other relevant bit of your pre-2010 experience, before you got elected as an MP for Grantham, was your work with Francis Morden Implementation Unit. Given how you view it now, 3 years on, was that actually a useful preparation for becoming a minister and useful preparation for government? Or was it, as we hear from all oppositions, we are doing more preparation than any other opposition in history?
I think it was very useful. I think that one of the striking things about this government, and in a sense about the appointments of the Prime Minister, is the number of times that he has put people in jobs who knew something about the area before, had thought about it, had really worked out what they think and what they would like to do if they were given a chance. And you look at Ian Duncan Smith, who devoted years to analysing all the problems he's now trying to deal with at the Centre for Social Justice. You look at Michael Gove, who spent so long both with Policy Exchange and as Shadow Education Secretary. And interestingly, it even extended, I think, into the reshuffle of which I was a small part. Liz Truss had done a huge amount of work on childcare before being appointed to the job in education. I had done, mainly with Policy Exchange, a lot of work on planning and housing. And I do think that the more that you thought about the things you're going to have to deal with and got into the question of how you're going to try and bring about some quite simple changes, the more you're capable of firstly making progress quickly, but secondly of sort of knowing whether what you're being told is accurate or just flannel. And so, I think that extent of preparation is incredibly helpful. The difficulty, of course, is it can't be done everywhere. People blow up, you're in a coalition you didn't expect to be, and so suddenly you find people in other jobs. And, it is important also to say that, one of the great successes of the government has been Theresa May, who had not spent a single second being Shadow Home Secretary. So I think it's probably particularly helpful if you're trying to do a sort of big reform programme, that you've thought about it a lot beforehand and thought about the how of delivery. Perhaps if you're not doing a major reform programme, then it's less important.
What about, looking personally as a minister, how useful was it to have been the Parliamentary Private Secretary for a period?
Not very. I think it can be. I think different ministers use PPSs differently, and perhaps probably different PPSs want to get involved in a different way. The main thing about being a PPS, and the point of the job, is not about the ministry, it's about Parliament. And that bit of it is useful in the sense that, I consider literally half of my job now is talking to MPs, council leaders who have concerns about how the policies we've introduced are playing out in their area.
Well,
and PPS, in a sense, should be doing that for a minister.
Yeah.
And so to that extent is useful, but insight into being a minister, close to zero.
Okay, you arrive at DCLG last September. Is there any induction? What happens? You're greeted by Bob Kerslake at the front door. What happens?
Well, the funny thing is my appointment was so weird because it took 36 hours after the fact that I was going to be made planning minister was put into the newspapers for anybody to get in touch with me at all. And I kept on thinking, oh my God, there's clearly some mad last-minute battle going on to stop it happening.
I think we already sacked you as a governor before you got appointed the minister.
Exactly. So it did mean that, in a sense, that the sort of reshuffle was old news by the time I actually turned up in the department. I did have induction, in a sense, the different teams in the planning bit, and the major strands of work that were carrying on. It was perhaps a bit unusual because what had happened is the reshuffle, I think, was on the 6th of September, and on the 5th of September, the government had announced a growth package, of which actually those bits that didn't, immediately sort of fall apart were mostly planning, and were going to be this bill that we've then spent the last 8 months putting through. So it wasn't like I was sitting there thinking, okay, right, what am I going to do? There was this enormous thing just sort of deposited into my lap the day before I turned up.
Did you have much conversation with Greg Clark, your predecessor?
Yes, actually, he was the first person, and because I ended up getting the call from the Prime Minister so late, I agreed with the Cruz, who's sitting in the front row, checking that I'm not getting him or me into trouble, which is a fairly full-time job, to be honest. And I agreed there was no point going to the department that evening. So I had a drink with Greg on the terrace. Actually, oddly, it was a very, very short drink, and it was he said 2 or 3 things, which I'm afraid I won't share with you, but they were all incredibly useful and insightful.
What about, you mentioned briefing on the planning, and you're in the middle of big legislation, big initiative and so on. What about just explaining how a minister's office worked, your private office, how it related to that of other ministers in the department, how it related to Eric Pickles and so on? Was there any kind of induction in that sense?
Yes, I mean, explanation, I think, is better. I mean, not very formal. It wasn't like, because there were a few new ministers. So Brandon Lewis was also newly appointed. Don Foster was also newly appointed at the same time. And we didn't have a sort of a programme of events, which I suspect probably does happen more when you have an incoming government. Yeah. But certainly, explanation. I guess the truth is I did have a huge advantage, which is I'd spent 2 years here. Being indoctrinated. So I did sort of feel like I vaguely knew the picture and the furniture.
Yeah. The other thing is, what sense was there of a team? Because one of the things which comes out very in contrast to the private sector, or certainly large organisations in the private sector, is all ministers are individuals. Not just your constituency link, but just in your careers, your ambitions. And that doesn't always produce conducive working if you look across the department, especially a big department like yours, which has lots of ministers. What sense do you feel, you're part of a team, or I'm in charge of planning and I've got to make sure that Eric Pickles is happy, but otherwise I just get on with their own thing? Yeah.
It is, there's no question it's very different than a team in the private sector. Not least because, generally speaking, in the private sector, the chief executive has picked the team. Whereas, in the department, the chief executive has picked the team, broadly speaking. And that obviously creates bigger challenges. This is going to sound incredibly creepy-crawly, but I'm going to say it, partly because I know that it isn't true everywhere, is that actually it's one thing that Eric Pickles does supremely well, because he doesn't try to micromanage, but he runs a weekly meeting that basically brings all of the tricky issues initially to a group of all the ministers and senior officials, and then at the end for just politicians and special advisors. And that meeting is very, very well structured, because basically anything that you want to, broadly speaking, get agreement to do, you have to bring to it. You have to tell him in advance that you're going to bring to it, so he knows, and he knows it's coming. And then he's got a very good sort of policy of, if you've ever got something you're worried about, come and see me, but otherwise get on with it. And so it's a very light rein, but let me tell you, when you feel it twitch, you certainly respond. And there's been an occasion where I felt it twitch.
Yes, in such uncontroversial areas you're operating in, Nick. But how do you feel the twitch? What's the mechanism for the twitch? Who does the twitch? Is it your private office, or?
There are various routes for the twitch. There's a great man without whom the Conservative Party would be nothing, called Sheridan Westlake. He is a form of the twitch, and that's a sort of certain. are you really sure that that's politically, sensible? And then, there are communications between private offices, shall we say, and then every now and then, I bump into him quite a lot. We see each other in the house as well, and every now and then Eric will say, "Hello, chum, come for a chat."
So it's the headmaster's study.
It's the headmaster's study, exactly.
Right.
I must say, I think it makes it much easier having somebody. I mean, I'm not young. I'm in my late 40s, but Eric is, he's a generation older than me, and he has enormous experience, and so it's very easy taking advice from him.
Now, you mentioned earlier Parliament. Given particularly the area you're in, where lots of people have views, lots of people have interests, and it affects also local councils, how much is there a kind of tension between the department, after only half a mile away from Parliament, saying, oh, you've got an absolutely vital meeting with the XYZ Federation, which means you've got to stick in the department or you've got to go make a speech somewhere in the country, as opposed to being in the House? How do you do that balance?
Well, I think I have an interesting, and from what I've heard from other junior ministers who I talk to, it's untypical, which is that my private office do not in any way try and colonise my time. And I actually increasingly now do not spend time in the department because it's right up near Victoria Station and it takes about a year to get up the lifts. And I spend almost all of my time in Parliament. And that sometimes it's meetings to which officials will come, but a lot of the time it's more political meetings. And they have never for a second said, you've got to go and see this incredibly boring organisation that's been trying to get in to see you for ages, rather than meet. I never get that. I have to say that is not the experience of all of my colleagues elsewhere in government. And there are some who feel completely sort of, in a straitjacket of the sort of just the endless pressure of administration. And I don't know whether I do wonder whether in part it's because, though planning is contentious, it's quite narrow in a sense. I don't have huge delivery organisations that I'm responsible for in the same way as, if you were in health or, DWP. So maybe that's part of the reason why. Maybe it's, the brilliance of my private secretary. But I feel completely in control of my time. And that's incredibly important to me because there would be nothing that would make me, cross her quicker.
Okay, so how do you allocate your time? Because you've got a constituency an hour and a half from London. An hour and a half from London. You probably visit more frequently than some of your predecessors who would have taken a different view of constituency views. But I mean, how do you allocate your time between constituency, going around the country as a minister, and Parliament and the department?
It's changed because when we had the bill, when we had the bill, I needed to be here more, and B, when we were still vaguely in a sort of policy development mode as being quite a major part of life, it was more important, I think, to be here, and I was learning the ropes of the subject matter and meeting all the different groups and that sort of stuff. But it's now changing, is that, bluntly, we're in, implementation and delivery phase, and then in about a year's time, we'll be in full-on political marketing phase. So I am now spending increasing amounts of time out of London. I mean, I was 3 days last week, 2 days the previous week. I'm trying sort of every fortnight to go and do some stuff with seats, with MPs and marginal seats, do some stuff with local authorities, and then if there's a community land trust somewhere or there's a self-build project or something, I might juggle that in too. And I think that, from my own view, that I think that it's incredibly important to do that, and increasingly important to do that, because the one thing, and this is not a criticism of the civil service at all, but you don't discover anything in a meeting in the department. You work out how to deal with stuff, you think through options, but you don't discover what's actually happening in people's lives who are working with this system that you're busy trying to create. You only discover it out and about. And it could be, I did a breakfast with the CBI this morning, and I discovered 2 or 3 things. In Shropshire, looking at a self-build scheme for 2 farmers' sons, I discovered some things. You just don't discover stuff internally, so you've got to get out. Constituency, I mean, I have a fantastic parliamentary office and constituency office who make it incredibly easy for me. I just try and keep it fairly strict. So basically, I'm there, 2 or 3 Fridays and Saturdays a month. One other, I tend to be off in Shropshire or Cornwall or whatever, and that works quite well. And then in my parliamentary office, I'm there in late afternoons to do correspondence and stuff like that. So it's not impossible.
What about media pressures? I mean, after you had a high media profile before you took office. Remember, this is a public event. Nick, is the world of Twitter, internet, how does that affect a minister's life now? I mean, we have 1 or 2 ministers, ex-ministers in the room who were way before the internet and other eras. And how does it affect it?
Well, I have this very surreal position, which is that there's this spoof of me called @General Boles on Twitter. And he's much funnier than I will ever be. And he knows an enormous amount about what I'm doing, a sort of worryingly large amount. Every now and then I do look at for crews and wonder if it's him. He's also very good at Photoshop, which is a slightly bizarre thing. And he's become really something that a lot of political journalists follow, and it isn't me. And it's quite nerve-wracking. It's like sort of having a cyber stalker, who at the moment is quite benign, but you sort of feel like could turn on me at any time. So that is a bit weird. And the media, it's interesting you sort of start with your lessons of how to be effective minister. I've always looked at Alistair Darling as probably one of the most effective ministers there's ever been. But you sort of got to know who you are. I'm never going to be Alistair Darling. There is an approach to being a minister, which is to drain everything of controversy. Somehow just sort of manage it steadily and quietly so that it all happens without anybody getting ruffled. Interestingly, I think Patrick McLaughlin is bringing many of the same skills to a job that actually Alistair Darling did, of somehow managing to make everything fine. And I look at that with awe. I just think, God, I wish I could do that. It's, that's not who I am. I like a fight, and I know that I'm sure that the department, I suspect even my Secretary of State might wish that I was a little bit more Darling-like in my approach, but it's not who I am. So.
Yes, I've noticed 1 or 2 late night evenings on news nights when you've had the odd fight on that.
Yeah.
Now, the other, we mentioned the civil service a bit. There are tensions in some departments with some ministers and civil servants feeling that they're not responding to the government's agenda, they're being obstructive. There's quite a long litany there. What's your experience been?
Well, I mean, I want to be very clear that I'm only speaking for myself, and as with the situation with my diary, I suspect different people in different departments have very different experiences they have to go through. But for me, I have to say, it's been fantastic. And I should also point out that there were a lot of changes made by Greg Clark and Eric Pickles in the years before I arrived, and I'm the beneficiary of that. And I suspect it perhaps wasn't quite so fantastic in 2010. But the officials I deal with regularly are superb, very bright, very quick to respond, get involved in an argument, but then sort of know when the decision's made and the time for argument is over. So I feel very fortunate. It has made me, maybe unfairly, because as I say, I may be just very lucky, but it has made me therefore a bit less persuaded by those who complain that the civil service is just out to frustrate. Because I have literally no experience of that in 8 months, whatever it is, I do think that there is some truth to the argument, that the counter-argument, which is that you just have to know what you want. And that as soon as you know what you want, that is then people will run with it and provide you with the evidence and provide you with the counter-arguments if necessary and all that, but they'll sort of get with the programme. It's when you're sort of sitting there in a sort of blue funk, not knowing what you think about anything, that's when it becomes frustrating. So I think that there is a little bit of excuses for indefinite, but as I say, it is just my narrow experience that. It may be that elsewhere that things are a bit different.
What about relations with special advisors? Because you mentioned one who's a fairly strong personality.
Legend in his own lifetime. Very good, very useful.
But how do they work with junior ministers as opposed to working for Eric?
I mean, I very much feel that they work for the team and the department. Obviously, their boss is Eric, as he's my boss too. I think that it's incredibly useful for me because I am I think it's always true in life. You have to know yourself, and I know that I am a bit impetuous and I'm a bit inclined to shoot from the hip, and that therefore it's really good to have someone who just said, have you thought about this? And the special advisors are very good at seeing around the political corners and seeing how things are going to play out, whether it's in a policy sense or in a media sense. So, I mean, I think they're invaluable. I don't personally feel, though I can understand how some junior ministers do, I don't personally feel that I need my own special advisors. I'm not quite sure what they'd do all day if I did. But having those two there is essential. And what's really important is that not just that they're there, but that officials talk to them and rely on their judgment, not just ministers. I think that's also really, really important.
How does it work with, I mean, you've got a Lib Dem minister.
Yes.
And particularly, the portfolios you have are highly sensitive to virtually every MP in your case, in England. And how does that collaboration work, given you're taking lots of decisions affecting lots of the constituents of Lib Dem MPs, and of course what Don Foster does vice versa?
I mean, we've got to remember, of course, Peter, is that generally everybody's delighted for me to take the decisions that nobody else wants to take, so that they can then blame me for them. And that extends equally to our Liberal Democrat partners. In terms of the sort of department's work, with Don, it's very easy. We have one thing that we share, which is neighbourhood planning, about which we're both passionate. But he can sell it to some audiences better than I can, and I can sell it to some audiences better than he can. I'm doing a review of planning guidance with Matthew Taylor, a former Lib Dem MP. Don is doing the review of building regulations. We need to have a sort of symbiotic approach without marking each other's homework. So actually, it, as I think is probably true in most parts of the coalition, where you don't have fundamentally opposed views of life, it works incredibly well. Unfortunately, we only have relatively few areas where we have fundamentally opposed views of life. Where we do, and there obviously are some, it must be, Department for Energy and Climate Change say, it must be harder work. But for us, it works well.
What are you talking of departmental structures? I mean, how much do you find there is a departmental view when you're dealing with, which is the Treasury, but also lots of other departments which come across the DCLG radar?
Quite a bit. I mean, I must say it does shock me slightly. There was a moment very early on when a note came to me asking if I wanted to share with, I think it was the Cabinet Office or the Treasury, some information that the department had in research that the department had either produced or commissioned. As if there was an expectation that I would say, no, don't share it, on no account share it. And I was, it's just completely obvious that we should share it. It is the government and we are all one government. So there is a bit of that. And, there is, we all know, and nobody better than the IFG, there's the Treasury View of Life and there's number 10 and it's sort of like a sort of searchlight. When you're in it, my God, you're in it, and then they disappear for 9 months, and then suddenly they're back. So you have to deal with that. I do think that it is, it's entirely understandable that the civil servants who are permanent, you grow a departmental culture. The department has a point of view and has various interests. That's, a sort of human inevitability. So it's particularly important that ministers don't share in that. I think in every department, ministers have to be and think of themselves as government ministers. And I rarely say I'm a minister in the Department for Communities and Local Government. It's just not how I think about it.
Yeah, but it ties in with something you said earlier, which is very interesting about when we were talking about the Heseltine model, involvement in management and so on. How do you see the dividing line now between you as a minister, as a member of the whole government, and the administration of what you're doing? I mean, because some ministers believe they should get involved very much so.
I mean, there's part of me, you know, but just as much as I'd like to be Alistair Darling, I'd also like to be Michael Heseltine. So there's part of me thought, you know, you should be redesigning the whole system of delivery, as it were. And I think maybe if you were a Secretary of State, that the inclination to do that might be more appropriate. I just think, you know, I've come in more than halfway through a Parliament, inherited an agenda that is fairly well developed, reporting to a man who's got, you know, 7 times the experience that I have. The idea of me, and with a permanent secretary who is also head of the civil service. So the idea that I'm going to suddenly come along and say, I've decided to redesign the team structure in the planning, you know, no.
No, you'd have 2 Yorkshiremen doing their bit and so on.
Exactly.
But within that, looking ahead, it's quite clear we're going to have whatever happens on the 26th of June, the announcement on spending. Look into the next Parliament. There's going to be further squeezes on administrative costs of a very large scale. So a lot of the traditional structures of the department will be very difficult to maintain. I mean, there are different models, a Finnish model, a Scottish model, where you have a much more unified structure, where the minister actually will have a portfolio of things he or she looks at, but the actual structure of departments may be very, very different indeed.
Personally, I mean, I'd totally welcome that. At the moment, I'm working quite closely with Owen Patterson on various things, and you know, it would feel natural that there might be a team that was a cross-departmental team that he and I met with. You know, I work quite closely with Michael Gove and on reforms to make it easier to put free schools into different kinds of buildings. So I think it will all be made much easier when, as seems to be inevitable, the entire government is in Marsham Street in the Home Office building. You know, if we're all then in one building under one roof, it might be easy to bring about. Well, look, and then maybe you could put DFID and the Foreign Office and the Ministry of Defence in one roof, but hey, they might not. The generals might not like that.
I don't think generals are like that, and I'm not sure about the Foreign Office and DFID in the same building. That would probably call for the services of the generals to separate them. But on the other thing you mentioned,
and I like, sorry, just a point because you did raise it. I particularly like this idea that you could appoint a minister who didn't have a department, but who had bits of different departments that all say you were the Minister for Young People, that you would actually have a bit of the Home Office and a bit of a team here and a team there, all reporting into you. And you'd have their budgets, their sub-budgets as your global budget. I think it would be a very interesting model for us to explore.
But I mean, that's in a sense, it's been a slight victim of the spending cuts, because spending is focused on departments, and therefore the cuts have been in departments, which has worked against a lot of the cross-cutting. And I know that Bob Kerslake, he said so here a number of times, trying to encourage looking at cross-cutting solutions. But it's very difficult in the traditional structure of Treasury negotiations with departments to do that.
I'm not sure if I buy that argument. I mean, I buy that there's resistance and, you know, turf war and all of that. Yeah, I'm not sure if I buy if it's harder when you're cutting. I actually think the cutting should make it happen.
Oh, no, but I'd agree with that. I'm just saying it's harder.
There's an argument which is, you know, very lively at the moment about the contribution the NHS makes towards social care. And, you know, the need for integration in the commissioning of healthcare and social care. And, you know, you can begin to see blurrings of lines already. And I think that will become even more important when the total pot of money that we're spending is less.
Yeah, you mentioned that the searchlight from number 10. Now, you are very closely associated with the Prime Minister, people at the top of the party, in opposition, well, going back to policy exchange, and then your implementation unit. What's the relationship now in number 10?
Between me and number 10?
Yeah,
or
yeah, you and number 10.
Oh, I hope very good.
No, but I mean, not
reshuffle in the offing.
I didn't mean in the political sense, Nick. I meant in the kind of operational sense. Yeah. I mean, do you feel in a very sensitive area, which gets a lot of high blood pressures amongst Tory MPs and Tory councillors. Do you get a sense that the number 10 are watching you?
Oh gosh, yes. But the less I hear from them, the better, because they're very, very busy, and so they'll, broadly speaking, only be in touch if they're worried about something. And so
That's the kind of twitch again on
it's an even more distant rain that twitches even less often, but more painfully when it does. I mean, that's not. There are also some positive things. So you get a call from somebody in the policy unit who says, "We're really keen to have something on X," and that's great actually to have, because you finally know what you're meant to be doing, but also you know that you have some authority for that thing. So long as you don't completely disagree with it, then it's great to go and run with it. But it is, it's not constant communication, and nor should it be. I mean, I do think that the idea that most of the management is coming from Prime Minister to Secretary of State, not from special advisor in number 10 to junior minister, is the right way, and it's a sign of ill health in the system if there's lots of back channels of management.
As happened in some of the Blair era.
Exactly. And I mean, I think some people have been quite frank about it. I think that when, I don't know why I used the word frank, but when Frank Dobson was Secretary of State for Health, I think it was pretty explicit that the way they got anything done was Alan Milburn, his deputy, and Simon Stevens in number 10, and that's how they made stuff happen. But that's a response to a problem. It's a way of managing dysfunctionality rather than functionality.
What about, do you get any sense you're being appraised at all? I mean, what feedback? All right, you've only been there 8-9 months. Is there any sense of appraisal that someone is saying, okay, well, this is how he's doing, or giving you a little bit of quiet advice?
There isn't, but there's about to be, because I have just foolishly volunteered to have Zoe manage a 360. So letters have gone to the Deputy Chief Whip, to Michael Fallon, with whom I did the bill, to Eric Pickles, to Sheridan, to officials at all levels in the department, to Cruz, on how I'm doing. And I haven't been strong-armed into it, though it may sound like it. I actually genuinely think that would be really useful. And the reason why it would be really useful is because, nobody gives you any feedback at all, ever.
But the interesting point about that exercise, and we're reassured to know that Zoe and myself are the only people who will see that in this building, as you well know, and indeed some interesting people we've done before, is that goes to you. What about appraisal from the Prime Minister, George Young as Chief Whip, and so on, in that sense? That they're coming up to a reshuffle. Okay, we've got a bit of paper here, Boles. This is the feedback we get from Bob Kerslake. This is the feedback we get from Eric Pickles. This is the feedback we get from whoever your whip is, and so on.
I literally have no idea. I mean, I don't know how systematic it is. I assume there is that process, but I assume it is literally that there's 2 days where they all sit in a room, and George Young says what he thinks he's sort of picked up along the way, and Eric says what he thinks, and Bob or Jeremy or whoever it is say what they think, and that sort of, and then lots of other political considerations of right, left, and male, female, and everything else comes into the mix. But there's certainly, you don't have any sense of that happening in a formal way, and certainly not in any sense that it's being shared with you.
Yeah. What about the development? Because in any other organisation, you would have, and the civil service, it applies to the civil service, they're forever going off on courses and things like that. But there is a sense of development that you're saying, okay, you're now a very prominent junior minister, but if you're going to move up a bit, you need a bit of help, broadening out. Does any of that occur at all?
No. None at all.
Should it?
I mean, in the ideal world, of course it should. It is quite tricky to see how you would organise it, because for the development to be intelligent, you'd have to sit down and say, okay, so this is how you're doing, this is who you are, this is your strengths and weaknesses, this is probably where you're heading, And so let's get you ready for that direction in which you are probably heading. That's what you do in a business.
Yeah.
But of course, what that is doing is anticipating a reshuffle, which A, the Prime Minister won't have thought about, and B, even if he had thought about it, would get completely revised 73 times between that time and that conversation and it actually happening. So it's hard to see how you anticipate a development path. And then offering the development once you've been appointed to the new job is very, very long way from, first best, because you feel desperately like you've got to get to grips with the job, and you've got to understand the brief, and you've got to meet the people, and you've got to start, start doing. And of course, what we should all do is say, actually, hang on, before I start doing any of those things, I am going to go away and have a bit of a chat. But that takes huge self-discipline, and I suspect that one's mind is not entirely on the development.
No.
I
mean, it's a dilemma we face in what we're trying to do at the IFG on exactly that issue.
I think that's why the transition work is so important, because I think if you can anticipate, if you can do that with an opposition before they come into government, then that is one time you might actually make it happen. To do it mid-term, very hard.
But as you know yourself, Nick, that from what happened pre-2010, and exactly the same is true pre-1997 for Labour, is that people aren't necessarily in the right frame of mind.
No.
That some are, but because most of your colleagues have never run anything, I mean, the classic was pre-1997, when we were doing the transition, Catherine Hadd and I were doing transitions work, was that people were taken off to a course. And I think it's Patricia Hewitt, who was then working for the big management consultants, explained quite a bit about, I got some organisational people in, to which response was, from people who then became cabinet ministers, this is all very well, but it's absolutely no relevance for us. We're just interested in policy. And they didn't appreciate at all the policy implementation intermix. And so it's even psychologically different there. I mean, it's desirable, but it's psychologically different to do.
I think it may be one of those insoluble problems of politics, of which there are a few.
Because the other aspect of it, I mean, the sense which you mentioned yourself, is that, and it was exposed very much last September when so many ministers got sacked, that an awful lot of them didn't know it was coming. I mean, whether it's people's own vanity or whatever, but they hadn't a clue it was coming, and it increased the shock. And you could argue the political problems of management for David Cameron and for George Young now as Chief Whip, a lot of people hadn't seen that this was likely to happen.
Do you really think a warning would help? I mean, I think that politics is this bizarre. Imagine in any other organisation where the people that you fire remain the people in control of whether you keep your job as chief executive. I mean, it's extraordinary. How many chief executives of companies would survive if everybody that they ever fired remained in the shareholders' meeting that re-elected them? It's amazing that prime ministers hang along as long as they do, frankly. But I'm not sure of warning people that, is... I mean, maybe with people who've had a good run and are getting on a bit, you might be able to say, this is probably going to be the time, and we've got lots of things we'd like you to do, and I know that the Queen very much looks forward to, and ... But I think that only applies to quite a few cases.
Yeah, indeed. And absolutely. I mean, because Gordon Brown used to have people who were czars or emissaries to various things, which was his way.
It'd be much easier if we still had an empire. We could, send them all off to govern bits of it. But,
Right. Now I'm going to open it up in a second. Just so a final general question. So, what lessons have you drawn for your 9 months of to be a minister? Which, if we'd been having this conversation a year ago, you would have said, right, I didn't expect that to happen.
I mean, I'm not sure if I put it quite that way, but I do have a lesson. I think for me that what's been liberating is firstly being given a job that I really, really care about, and I really think I know what needs to happen. And secondly, then to approach it as if it's your last job. And it may well be, either because the Prime Minister will, choose differently, or because we won't be in government after 2015 or whatever. I think that is a liberation. I think that certainly this job, it would be impossible to do this job well if you were basically primarily worried about your short-term political share price. because it is not a job that goes with that. And you could only do it if you were worrying about that more than anything else. All you could do is sort of try and contain and prevent things from happening, and you get nothing done. So it is a sort of liberation, knowing what you want to do and sort of thinking, well, this might be it. This is maybe my go in the driving seat. If you didn't have that, I think it would be much harder to work out how to get anything done that was worthwhile. But
connected with that is, I mean, it's a very interesting point you made right at the beginning about those ministers who've been most successful have been those who had worked on his opposition or cared about it. You worked on a lot of the planning issues when you were at Policy Exchange. Liz Truss had done Child and so on and so forth. And worked on it some time. How important is it? I mean, and it isn't always possible, as you point out, because the coalition, what happened with Theresa May, when the irony was the civil servants in the Home Office knew more about the policy which Chris Grayling had talked to them about in the Access talks than she did. And there wasn't immediate, and that created some problems. But how vital is it for you to say, when you arrived in September, all right, you inherited legislation, you inherited a structure which Greg Clark had created and so on. These are half a dozen things I want to do. And taking your point, this might be my final job.
I think that knowing that, I mean, half a dozen is a lot.
I know, yeah.
3 or 4 things that you're trying to get done. And it's sort of 2 types of things. It's I want to make this change to guidance or legislation or, incentives. But even more important than that is, what are you ultimately trying to do? I have a very simple thing. I want to build more houses. Stop. That's it. I want to build more houses. And I know that the problem is land. And so I want to supply more land for building of houses. That's it. And that's what it is about the simplification. You've got to get it down to something as clear as that, because then that gives you a sort of benchmark against which to make every decision. And in case sometimes you'll decide to be politically a bit canny, but you've got to know what your lodestar is, and that is mine. And I think probably in any job, Liz Truss's is, I want to make childcare cheaper and more available. Stop. And if you don't have that, then I think you'll be at sea.
But I wonder how many jobs that actually applies to. Funny enough, I was talking yesterday to a former Labour cabinet minister who's here. We were talking about how you measure effectiveness of political leaders. And he was looking at various electoral measures and so on. And the question I was raising is, okay, how do you look at them as ministers? How do you look at the effective? Now, you've defined a very clear objective, Nick, and you've defined what Liz Truss can have. An awful lot of jobs. I mean, if you're, say, Alistair Burt in the Foreign Office, how the hell do you define an objective as clear as that when you have virtually no influence over the outcome?
I think you're absolutely right. I think it's an incredibly important point in this. I think that there are very different types of ministerial job, and there are representative jobs, and there are managing stuff that happens jobs. I mean, we all have elements of that in our lives, and then there are reform jobs. And, there are some people who are brilliant at the managing stuff that happens, but who might not be particularly inspired reformers, because maybe that's not the way they think and it's not what motivates them. And I think an ability to marry up the individual with the kind of ministerial job. I hadn't thought of it that way before, but I think that's exactly right. I think that probably only a quarter of the jobs in government are really reform jobs. A lot of it's just keeping the show on the road.
Yeah. Not the Steve Hilton view, of course. Because Steve's view, I remember him sitting here without shoes, without tie, exactly a year ago before he went off to Stanford. And Steve saying, oh, well, of course, he was his party trick, remember, how much of the paper going through number 10 was actually related to the priorities even in the coalition agreement, let alone the Tory manifesto. And it was a pretty small percentage, to which the response is, yeah, but government's got to carry on. It's got ordinary business to do.
I mean, I love Steve, but he's a zealot. And he also realises that, his role was to be the disruptive force. My God, did he succeed at that? The truth is, we're an old country with lots of history and lots of inherited institutions and lots of responsibilities, and they've got to be managed. We didn't come into government to liberate Libya. But it happened, and it consumed an enormous amount of time, and we had to do it well. And that's certainly, again, returning to Theresa May, I would have thought that a good 70% probably of the Home Secretary's job is that. And it's got to be done really well with grip and authority and seriousness. It doesn't mean that you have to be a sort of driven, single-minded reformer.
Right. Now we've got time for 3 or 4 questions. David.
David Walker, Guardian Public Leaders Network. Is it fair, Nick, to contrast the fulsome, even extravagant praise you've lavished on the civil service with the view taken, for example, by Francis Maud, who, in a speech at Policy Exchange this evening, will register at least a kind of rather scratchy frustration at the slow progress of even your attempts at civil service reform. It's notable you said there's not a meeting you go to in CLG where you learn anything. That could sound like a pretty damning criticism of the cognitive or other capacities of the civil service in that department.
Yeah, well, I mean, David, your job is to put words in people's mouths and twist them. That is not what I meant at all. I mean, I sit on Francis's Civil Service Reform Board, and I totally support the attempts to reform the structure of the civil service and the unity of it, the paciness of it, the risk-taking abilities of it. And I think that anybody who also sits in those meetings will tell you that nobody has been as frustrated with some of the way that that particular programme is being managed and expressed than me. What I'm referring to is the quality of the officials in my team who provide me with advice to make decisions about planning. They are superb, and I cannot fault them. I think the structure of the civil service, the way it promotes people, the way it picks people, the way it rewards people, the qualities it encourages in people, almost all of it is potty. And the fact that I have good officials giving me superb advice is largely testament to them and their individual qualities, because they are trying to work in a system that is prehistoric. So there is absolutely no inconsistency between saying that I have superb civil servants on my policy role and that the civil service as a structure desperately needs reform.
Good.
Alan Evans, Scotland Office and attached to the IFG. A very simple question. Do we have too many ministers, too few ministers, or just the right amount?
Yeah, it's a tricky question to answer.
You have 2 you work for, Alan.
I mean, certainly one would be inclined to say we have too many. On the other hand, not many of them seem to be, sort of sitting back having long lunches and not doing very much. And I think it's because our system has developed where we involve politicians at a level of detail that other systems don't. And that's a decision. And because of the way in which parliamentary democracy works and political parties work, it would be quite hard to see how you could sustain a parliamentary majority if you only had 20 jobs to give out, bluntly. So I think that's probably one of the reasons why our system has developed in that direction. But what is it? Is it 110 or something like that? I mean, it seems a huge number. We also shouldn't underestimate the extent of the parliamentary requirement of ministers, particularly in the Lords. You know, if we didn't have the Lords in the way it is, would we need to have quite so many ministers in the Lords? The intensity with which they have to answer questions on almost every subject in the brief without any real warning, without much limit, is a particular feature of our system. So it's one of those questions where I think that, in a sense, the obvious answer is the right answer, but it doesn't take you very far, because where we are is a product of our system, and unless you change the underlying drivers that have produced that, you're probably not going to change the number of ministers.
Because another factor is Europe. Presumably you don't have...
Thank God.
Yes, indeed. I was going to say, you don't have to go to councils and things like that.
No. I've been once invited to go to say something about Natural England, no, what is it called? The Habitats Directive. But that was a fate worse than death, so I didn't.
For the habitat or you?
No, I'm very pro-habitat.
Stephen Swinford from the Daily Telegraph. Just on the subject of housing, you talk about the need for more housing. Do you think that in the long term that greenbelt protections might need to be relaxed to accommodate more housing, or for more housing to be built?
Another nice try.
I think there's a red flag in front of that question.
It has always been within the power of local authorities to determine and to vary their greenbelt boundaries. It's for them to do it if they feel that it is necessary to do it, but only in consultation with local people through a local plan process. We have no intention of changing that position.
I think you've said
Was that good? That was quite a good straight bat, wasn't it, Matthew?
I think you've given that answer a number of times before, Nick, quite a few times before. Okay, come back on that, the point Alan raised on the number of ministers. I mean, you go back over a century ago, and we had a third of the number of ministers we do now. And actually, the majority of them were in the, in the Balfour government, half of them were in the Lords. Now, all right, we didn't have the welfare state. A large part of the local government board was distributing money, or not very much money at that.
But again, I think you're focusing on the wrong end. That's not the driver. The driver is, so read Margaret Thatcher's biography by Charles Moore, fantastic book,
exactly.
by the way. What you see is that she came in at a time when a very substantial proportion of the Conservative Parliamentary Party, at least, were people who had often fought in the war, maybe carried on serving in the armed forces, who couldn't think of anything worse than being a minister, had no intention of trying to get ministerial office. Parliament was their objective, being in Parliament, sitting on a committee maybe, attending the 1922 and being the voice of England in Westminster was what their ambition was. And so you didn't have to worry about how to keep them happy. We now have a system, for better or for worse, where a very large number of people who go into politics because they want to have a brief moment of exercising some power in government. And relatively few. I hope that this is beginning to change again, because I observe that some of the most talented people in my intake, in my party, just to pick them out, or from previous intakes, Douglas Carswell, Robert Halfon, Zach Goldsmith, Sarah Wollaston, they seem to be motivated by being strong, independent backbench MPs campaigning on particular issues. The more of that you have, the less pressure there will be, in a sense, to have a lot of jobs. But the source of this problem is not the number of tasks there are to do. The source of this problem is how do you keep a parliamentary majority behind you? You've got to have a lot of jobs for people who all think that they're good at doing them. In truth, most of whom think that they'd be better at doing the Prime Minister's job than the Prime Minister.
No, I mean, the market solution, that would, of course, be to cut MPs' pay and make people less motivated to want to be professional politicians.
Oh, God.
But I won't get into that. I won't get into that at all. But actually, we're not going to finish. But one final thing. You mentioned Charles Moore's wonderful biography of Margaret Thatcher. It's a brilliant, brilliant book. The link with Grantham, he describes a kind of vibrant local politics, not in the party sense, on the council in the 30s and 40s with the great alderman and so on, and then who gets pushed out when it happens. Do you recognise that locally at all now? Because I mean, a lot of what you do is dependent on a vibrant local politics. Your job as planning minister. Has that passed?
I mean, I think it's obviously changed a lot, and levels of turnout and levels of involvement have sunk. Though I would just, in parenthesis, my favourite achievement, if it could be said as that of recently, is that in the Tame referendum on their neighbourhood plan, they got 40% turnout, when in the county council election on the same day, they had 36% turnout. So that meant that people were turning up to the polls to vote for a neighbourhood plan who didn't vote for a county council candidate.
Because they cared about it.
So exactly. So it is possible to get people involved if you're asking a question that they're interested in the answer of. So I think that the extent of engagement in local politics has obviously changed. And as you say, that sort of the whole alderman culture, it's past. What I do notice, though, and now this is as an outsider to Lincolnshire and to Grantham, is that, I mean, she said it somewhere. She said somewhere, and then Charles quotes it, that she said, I formed all of my beliefs and principles before the age of 17. And you could completely see it. I mean, everything about her, she imported the values of a particular place. Never been a rich place. I mean, I have Stamford in my constituency, which is very beautiful and quite prosperous and has a long history of being prosperous. Grantham has never been rich, has never been flash, has never been fashionable, but is quite sort of stubbornly proud of who it is and what it does and what it believes in. And it's quite eerie the way, that totally defined her response to almost every question put before her throughout that extraordinary journey that she went on. And I think that it'd be very hard to think of another prime minister, perhaps, and I'm not a historian, whose whole record in government and approach to political leadership was as defined by the place where they grew up than her.
I might say John Major and Brixton, but we'll leave that. Nick Boles, thank you very much indeed. It's been absolutely fascinating.